Thank you very much, everybody in the room, and welcome to people online as well. Welcome to ODI for this really stimulating and very exciting panel discussion, which we have entitled "Bringing the Bondholders." This is a great privilege for us at ODI to welcome the author of a really excellent and very stimulating book, Greg Makoff. Thank you very much. Let's show the book, called Default, which is a fantastic, really amazing read around the debt crisis in Argentina and the judicial saga that has engulfed the country between 2002 and 2015 onwards, and of course, we'll talk about Argentina's today. I'm Frédéric Dahan, the Director of Development and Public Finance, and we have put together a great panel to discuss Greg's book, but more importantly, to discuss what the book tells us about the world today and some of the dynamics that we have seen in a number of countries in debt distress and even defaulted countries. So we'll have a discussion which I think will oscillate between looking at the past, understanding the past, but also present and future. So without further ado, I will give Greg the floor to speak for about 10 minutes or so about the book, and then we'll move to the panel. Maybe a few words about Greg. Greg is an expert, of course, on sovereign debt restructuring. He has worked for 21 years in investment banking, advising companies, financial institutions, and of course, debtor countries, including Jamaica, Colombia, the Philippines, and Turkey. Also worked at the US Treasury between 2015 and 2016. And on the team that supported Puerto Rico, in particular the enactment of the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management and Economic Stability Act, which has facilitated the reform of Puerto Rico's public sector and the restructuring of its debt. And interestingly, and maybe not surprisingly, Greg is in fact a physicist. He has a PhD in physics at the University of Chicago. And I think it's probably that mixture of oversight of different disciplines that has given Greg a really unique, quite engaging perspective on sovereign debt. But let's hear it directly from the author.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Frédéric, and for ODI for inviting this talk. And this book is about the ultimate car crash and sovereign debt restructuring. Everything that could go wrong went wrong, and I present it as a drama because up to this, the legal literature and economics literature is just impossible to read because it's written by experts who are very much into the equations or the legal opinions, and I'm saying, how do the negotiations work? So I bring you in the room to see how countries fight with the IMF over their program. How do creditors go to court and try to attach things? And how do judges make impossible decisions? And so it's very accessible. And I often, talking to sovereign debt experts, were at a conference and explain how the book is interesting. Then I turn to her husband or his wife and say, you should read it too. You can know what your husband does, your wife does, and it's fun. So it's for everyone. Who's interested in the topic. It is not just for specialists. I put a lot of technical detail in the footnotes. So if you're really, like Rodrigo, a specialist, you will very much enjoy the legal footnotes, but most people will skip them. I'd add to my resume, I lived here for 7 years. I worked with some people here. We were at Citi together, and we did some sovereign stuff. And I was part of wasn't a car crash, but the bankruptcy of Railtrack in 2003, where the firm I was working with was advising the Department of Transport. And I had to deal with the problem, what do we do about the bonds? Because the government can no longer, with the private company, keep shoving in money when people were dying. And so while it wasn't the sovereign's debt itself, it ended up being an issue with the rating agencies. So it's a unique situation to be with a government dealing with a serious debt problem, whether in Argentina, 100 billion of its own debt, or Railtrack, $5 or $7 billion that is funding the railways that needs to be managed. And so I can very much get the context here, having spent some time, and I'll keep that in mind in the comments. In this book, it's really the longest, messiest, most horrible debt restructuring in history. It took from the 2001 default until April 2016 to resolve 99% of the debt. There's actually a little litigation going on today. I worked for Jamaica. The public part of it, we resolved it in 3 months, maybe 6 months before that. Most other countries resolved it in a year or two. Why did this take 15 years? And the relevance to today is there were a lot of mistakes. And mistakes are useful to study because they suggest how do we fix the world. But the different parts of the book highlight software errors, which need software fixes, and hardware errors that need hardware fixes. And it's broken between the two phases. The first third of the book is about the deal. Argentina restructured its debt in a voluntary offer made to creditors, a vote of sorts, in 2005. And Argentina's problem was it was fighting with the IMF and bondholders over the terms of the deal. It was like a disputed proxy battle. And it was attacked viciously in the press, but Argentina got a 76% success rate on what was 82 billion of bonds, which meant there were 24% didn't take it, which was about $20 billion of bonds, and those people sued forever. So you started with this big dispute over what should be the terms of the IMF program and what should be the terms of the deal. That was software. There were a lot of human errors. Argentina made errors, the IMF made errors, the US Treasury made errors, bondholders made errors. And so the first 100 pages are, how did this messy deal come about with this suboptimal result? Other countries who did offers like this, like Uruguay, got 91% success rate, but Argentina got 76. I promise you, if Argentina got 91, 92, it wouldn't have had this messy legal ending because the judges wouldn't have gotten so frustrated. But all the mistakes that could be made were made. In studying it, you can say, okay, well, how can we make sure everybody gets along better next time? The latter part of the story is in court. What happens to those 20 billion when they go to New York and they go to Germany and elsewhere to sue and to attach things? Dramatically, they attach stuff in New York, bank accounts and bond accounts, and they tried to attach satellite launch slots. They did discovery on every big oil company. They sent subpoenas, give us all the information on the business you do with Argentina. They were papering the United States with legal motions, the plaintiffs. And it wasn't just one big hedge fund. It was a group of hedge funds plus hundreds of small plaintiffs. Argentina pissed off a lot of people. In the 90s, it had always been like one aggressive plaintiff and everybody else, all the banks agreed on a deal. But after 2000, you had this sort of mass litigation starting. And Argentina was the first to see that. And that taught about a hardware problem. And the first page of the book in the introduction has Ann Kruger, the first deputy managing director of the IMF, 2001, 2 weeks before the IMF pulls the plug on Argentina, which they all knew they were going to do, and everybody in the audience knew this was coming. She says, there's a gaping hole in the financial architecture to help countries who are in debt distress. There's no bankruptcy system. It's high time this is filled. Opening words. We have a problem. Private creditors are increasingly numerous, anonymous, and difficult to coordinate. Meaning banks, a small group of banks had lent in the 80s and 90s, but in the 90s, the market had moved to bonds. So instead of having 200 banks lending, you had 20,000 bond investors or hundreds of thousands of bond investors. Increasingly numerous, anonymous, difficult to coordinate, and some of them have bad intentions, including a vulture fund called Elliott Associates, who just got paid in full by suing Peru. That's how the story starts. And the latter 2/3 of the book prove you do have a problem, a hardware problem. There's no way, if you do an offer, Argentina had 76%, and later it reopened its offer, it got 92%. What do you do with the rest? Without a bankruptcy system, the rest sue. So let's say you settle voluntarily with 76% and 24% sue. Then you settle with 92% and 8% sue for another 5 or 10 years. Then you settle with 99% and you spend another 10 years in court because the last 1%, and they're still working on the last 0.1. You can't have this go on forever. That's why you have bankruptcy. But the world decided in the context of this not to do Ann Kruger's proposal, but to do John Taylor and the US Treasury's proposal to do collective action clauses in sovereign bonds so that if in a pool of bonds, you get 75% voting in favor, 100% of the bonds are bound. So 1 or 2% or 5% can't just say, oh, I'm going to stay out and sue for full while those guys took 10 cents on the dollar. So now there's a mechanism to bind in. And since all the disruption caused by this book, by this story, which was a redefault in 2014 because the judge made a crazy court order, the market said, okay, we didn't really want these clauses, but please give them to us. So the market accepted these very powerful voting clauses because they didn't want sovereign bankruptcy and a judge and complexity, but we'll take voting clauses in our bonds. We don't like these holdout hedge funds because in the end, the 92% who took Argentina's deal had their payments blocked by the judge to force Argentina to pay the last 8% in full. In the 92%, we don't like that. That's not fair. We don't want disruption. We want everybody to get the same deal. In portfolio management, the positive alpha from the 8% was negative alpha for the 92%, and they're all competing with each other to get funds. They're like, we don't like that. So there's now a knowledge in the investment community, if you can add laws and rules which protect the majority against tyrannical minorities, there is a consensus in favor of that. But that's the story. The book could really be called How the World Got Aggregated CACs, but it would sell more books to say the landmark court battle over Argentina's $100 billion debt restructuring. So that's what this really is, but it's about errors, software errors, hardware errors, and really a testament to all the great policymakers who worked on getting aggregated CACs into the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. And I can testify the book does read like a novel, and it's very gripping. And although you know, of course, that things are going to go wrong, you still read through hoping that there will be some consensus emerging. But of course, it's the battle that we know, and it's full of characters. I think it's really accessible as a novel would. Let me now introduce our great panel and get the conversation going over these issues. Let me start first on my left, Rodrigo Olivares Caminal, who is a professor in banking and financial law at the Center for Commercial Studies at Queen Mary University of London. Rodrigo is a very well-known expert in this field, has advised a number of international bodies such as World Bank, IFC, EBRD, consultant in DC and Europe, and of course supporting international transactions with law firms. And then further on my left, we have Théo Marais, who is an associate at GSA, who is contributing to the research effort of the firm on sovereign debt issue and the international financial architecture. Theo is very active on X, formerly Twitter, and is a joy to read his insight, always very punchy and insightful. So he's before joining GSA, Theo worked at the French Treasury as well as the Paris School of Economics. So looking forward to your insight. And maybe I'll kick the discussion around something that Craig just mentioned, that Argentina was bad luck. That could never have happened if there had been more of a consensus of bondholders. And yet, I think that when we think of Argentina in the context of sovereign debt, there is something of a enfant terrible, that Argentina is seen permanently to be in trouble. So the question that I will put to Rodrigo and Theo maybe is, well, is really Argentina like a serial defaulter, or was it just bad luck? And more importantly, what does the story of Argentina can teach to other countries such as Zambia, Sri Lanka, etc.? Rodrigo.
Thank you, Frederick. Let me start with two disclaimers. One is opinions are personal, and the second one is I'm Argentinian myself, so I have default in my DNA, and I'm going to be quite candid. Couple of things. Let me start by saying bad luck. I'm not sure I entirely buy the argument of bad luck, because it is a fascinating book. My only critique probably to Greg is that basically he didn't indicate it on the cover which default he was referring to, because basically Argentina has defaulted already 9 times. So to an extent, and I was actively involved in what was happening in Argentina during this default, and the reality is that Argentina took a very aggressive stance from the outset. Argentina proposed a very big haircut, and I think that basically that was also delayed for several years, which basically Greg correctly points out. I think he mentioned the case of Uruguay. Uruguay is, for me, is the best restructuring ever. It's a textbook case of what needs to be done. Uruguay in 30 days went back to the market. And Argentina defaulted in December 2001, and the restructuring took place, if I'm not mistaken, Greg, it was 2005, right?
June 2005.
So basically, that's how long it took Argentina to come up with an exchange offer. So the issue of bad luck, I would say probably bad timing, probably, but bad luck, I'm not entirely sure. And basically, is Argentina really different? I think that was the lines of your question. Is Argentina really different? I think that there have been some changes in the international architecture. There have been also some changes in the landscape, because I think that the creditor composition has changed considerably. But I think that basically Argentina is, to an extent, still stuck in some kind of the same predicament. The main creditor of Argentina is the IMF. The IMF was a very big creditor back then. Argentina financed itself through mostly bonds. Now we have better bonds, and I put the better bonds in between inverted commas, in the sense that there are the modern state-of-the-art debt instruments with under trust indenture and with collective action clauses. So I think that, but it's pretty much the debt composition the same. And but what I was highlighting is that what we have now is the world seems to have moved on, and I think that there are other cases that we are witnessing with newer tools that still need some perfectioning, but I think that countries understand the difficulties of getting into a long, protracted restructuring, like the ones that Argentina has usually been involved in. And what happened in the latest restructuring, the follow-up chapter of that book, which was the one in 2020, was it right? In 2020, again, there were 2 restructurings pretty much at the same time. 2 Latin American countries, same kind of debt instruments, pretty much same creditors on both countries, pretty much same advisors on both countries, on the debtor and creditor side. So it was kind of a copycat situation, and Argentina took, again, the aggressive path, while Ecuador took a complete different approach. Ecuador was launched later and closed earlier. So that's why basically I do not fully agree with the bad luck issue.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Theo.
So thanks, ODI, for having us. I highly recommend you read Greg's book as a psychological thriller about like a judge getting madder and madder until he finally gives the injunction. I will start by disclaiming, like disclaimer, like Rodrigo. My disclaimer is that I was 3 years old when Argentina defaulted. So when I started looking at this stuff, it was later in 2022. And when I read Greg's book, it described a completely different world than the one we are seeing now in the restructurings in the likes of Zambia, Sri Lanka, Ghana. So I tried to understand what has changed and how we can take lessons from what happened in Argentina. A first observation is that the hurdle for bondholders to litigate has gone much higher, partly because the likelihood of success is lower now that pari passu has been fixed, now that the CACs are efficient, and also maybe because of reputational risk. The creditors that are on this steering committee of bondholders negotiating with countries, the reputational risk of litigating against a poor country, I think, is more important. And partly also because you have real money accounts, like the big passive asset managers that will be in these committees, and they will clearly not have the same incentive or ability to litigate as some hedge funds might have had in the past. Zambia is a perfect example of that. The restructuring negotiations with bondholders have been blocked for more than 3 years. Bondholders have been dragged in the mud. They have not been able to even start negotiating while China was holding up the IMF program. China was holding up the comparability assessment. And despite all this mess, you didn't see any litigation. You didn't see even acceleration from bondholders in the case of Zambia, which I think goes to show how really the hurdle to litigate and try to extract more recovery is not the case anymore. That said, we still have holdouts. They are not the same. Holdouts, they hold out because they have leverage. And the type of leverage that creditors have today is different. The holdouts today might be Chinese policy banks that have political leverage over the debtor country. It might be commodity traders that have financial leverage in the form of collateral over the country, as we saw in Chad, when the big commercial creditor held up a restructuring for some time, because they were lifting physically the collateral and paying back the country, so the country couldn't even default on them. And then you have the emergence in the tectonic shift of the creditor landscape in low-income countries. You have the emergence of so-called plurilateral institutions that will be regional development banks with weird shareholding patterns that might have both political and financial leverage over the country and try to hold out of the restructuring. And clearly we can say that the architecture is ill-equipped to deal with these new holdouts of today. CACs obviously don't apply to these creditors. The IMF arrears policies are also ill-equipped to deal with creditors that have significant leverage. The IMF recently unveiled a reform of its arrears policies that might facilitate the progress, but it won't apply to creditors with collateral, for instance. So it's unclear what kind of policy change we need in order to deal with these holdouts. And I think here Greg's software vs hardware metaphor is really useful, and I'd be curious to hear more of Greg's views in this regard. And a final point on the lessons we take from Argentina. It's maybe a bit of a segue, but one big lesson from what happened in Argentina, in my view, is the behavior of the IMF in the bigger emerging market economies today. The IMF doesn't want anymore to be alone or to be so big at the table among other creditors. Because the IMF's business model rests on the IMF being a preferred creditor. And when everybody is preferred in the dead stock, nobody is preferred anymore. And so the IMF, when faced with the choice in Egypt, in Pakistan, in Ukraine, to go all in, they've shown restraint. And I think it's also because the shadow of Argentina looms over these situations. And in Egypt, the IMF, if we look at it, is a net negative creditor over the next couple of years. They had the choice to go all in and to play it like in Argentina, but what they did is to, even after the increase of the IMF program that they did recently this year, they are putting 8 billion on the table. They are getting 12 billion back in the next 3 years from previous program. Who is financing the IMF programs in Egypt, in Pakistan? It's the Gulf countries, it's China, it's outside stakeholders, because the IMF, in my view, after Argentina, does not want to end up as the biggest massive elephant in the room that basically implies a wipeout if ever you have a shock and you need a restructuring. Similarly in Ukraine, where the IMF only came in after a modification of its financing assurances policies, and basically the IMF has a blank check from a group of countries, mostly the G7, to put up a top up in terms of financing and debt relief if any problem arises down the road. So I would take it as a lesson taken from Argentina's predicament.
Thank you very much, Theo. Any reaction? We can.
No, keep going. Those were great, great comments, and throw more provocative questions.
Absolutely. So now that's really, I think it's really interesting. We see a bit of a story emerging, but what is fascinating is that bondholders today are still, private creditors, I would say, are still very much pointed in international circles at the bad guys. And we've seen in the last couple of years a number of bills that were submitted to New York Assembly and Senate that are trying to bring the power of statutory provisions to bring some discipline vis-a-vis private creditors, in particular bondholders, since about half of all bond issued around the world, sovereign bonds, are governed by New York law. So the question is, Greg, why is that, and what could these reforms, the provision submitted or a different version of them, could bring to this architecture we were just discussing?
Well, I think it's great to talk about, and it's great to talk about here, given potential change in government in the UK, where in the end, we need to talk about UK law and New York law together, because that covers the vast majority of debt. But as I said, we need to distinguish software errors from hardware errors, and we need to separate the problems of the past from the problems of the future. And when we look at the slow Zambia restructuring and analogous events in Suriname or Congo or Ecuador, other countries which were slowed down by China being brought into the international system, for me, that's a software problem. And I've been very encouraged by whatever wise policymakers came up with the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. And some skeptics have said, well, this has achieved nothing. And I'm like, who said it was supposed to achieve anything? It's foreign relations school people do study something called confidence building measures, CBMs. I'm like, what are those? And I'm like, oh, you just kind of get people together and you talk and you reduce the tensions and you get people working together again when they've all been upset, kind of at war with each other, find a safe space, talk about the issues. And with China and the G20 and the US and the IMF, this discussion process has been slowly going through all the issues, mostly of the common framework and how do we make sure deals are fair, how do we make sure they're timely, how do we include domestic debt. These are the issues. And I think it's been extremely positive. And my interpretation is they have helped China feel welcome, make China feel it is being heard, and has helped China move faster, like it has in announcing its early support for Sri Lanka. And so I think the bigger problem has been software of inviting, and it's an international relations problem. And so there is absolutely nothing you can do in New York law that would help the biggest problem of the world, which is a software problem. And when you read the rhetoric around some of the laws, of which there are 3, it's like, Elliot, we have to get Elliot. And I'm like, well, we got Elliot. We got CACs. We got aggregated CACs. The market put them out of business on purpose. 80% of bonds have these aggregated CACs. That's yesterday's war. That's not today's problem. And he's like, well, make the common framework go faster. And I'm like, how are you going to do that with the New York law? The problem is getting China comfortable with the IMF. Changing a New York law and adding more parts to an already complicated machine is not going to help. And so I have written skeptically about the 3 bills, which I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it does seem that the bad and the ugly, which were tied together, is kind of stalling. And the better one, which is more limited and narrowly targeted, has life. It was reintroduced yesterday in a much better form. So there are marginal things you can do under New York and English law, but for me, they have to complement collective action clauses. They have to address, let's say 80% of the world's bonds have collective action clauses, but 20% of old bonds don't. Maybe you can do something under law to get loans that don't have CACs, or the 20% of old bonds that don't have CACs, but having well-meaning social activists say, let's rewrite the whole system and ignore the CACs and ignore everything we've done because we're frustrated and we want to put a thumb on the scale in favor of poor countries. And the reality is, you have this distribution of countries who borrow from the market. It's only a couple percent like Argentina who default all the time, in Ecuador and Belize and Venezuela. All the other countries, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Philippines, Indonesia, who I all worked with, they need to go to the market and borrow bonds every day of the year. And if you make it easier to default, their cost of funding goes up. You hurt developing countries when you make default too easy. It's not a free lunch. And so there's very often disconnects. And so that's why you have consultations. And part of the problem with these New York laws, some of them were done completely non-consultative, with activists saying, let's just push this over the line because we have the votes. And the 3rd bill just opened a window for it has been amended in light of consultation from creditors, and they've opened a window to invite comments on the final drafting of the law. So I think that is, as shown in the book, incredibly complicated. It's important not to make policy errors because they have big consequences. And it's hard for all of us. It's hard for the IMF. It's a mess fixing a broken country. And there's no simple solution. So that's my kind of rant about the New York laws.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Rodrigo, you are a lawyer yourself. So what is your take on these laws? And not necessarily, just maybe to complement also Greg, what do you think the UK could potentially draw from those experiments and proposal on the table that could be helpful and not harm actually emerging markets, certainly with an increase of a cost of funding?
Thank you, Frederic. I will start by saying that I completely agree with Greg's remarks. I'm going to add a couple of color to it on some probably slightly more legal issues, but I think that we are pretty much aligned on this. I think, and then I will build towards the end the issue of going forward, what can be done, right? Resolving a debt crisis implies amending existing valid legal agreements. So this implies that there's the rule of law, and that needs to be amended by means of negotiation. And I think that basically you cannot impose a haircut on a creditor where the lenders are so diverse and they lend for different motives. In addition to that, trying to amend or change the status quo and undermining the rule of law with a new law, which that will become the new rule of law, but that will affect existing contracts, basically that will seriously undermine much of the progress that has been made through CACs, through clarifying pari passu, through the common framework. So it will be going to an extent against the international initiatives and the progress made in the last 15, 20 years. And I think it is a software issue. It's an issue about coordination. And with a law, a New York law, basically, and going back to what Theo was saying about who are the holdouts nowadays, because basically the world has changed. This will not solve the problem with the Chinese banks because they will not be covered by New York law, and this will not solve the issue of the plurilaterals, which are one of the big holdouts nowadays, because basically they are not governed by New York law either. So basically, out of the three holdout problems, and basically the other one is the commodity traders, which basically I can neither confirm nor deny, but I might not have seen any of their contracts, and it's as simple as choosing a different governing law. So basically, I don't think that this brings a solution, and on the contrary, what you are seeing is you are already seeing a market reaction. In Suriname, in the restructuring of Suriname, this is extremely technical, very dark, only for sovereign debt junkies and lawyers who read into dark and obscure clauses. To change the governing law of the contract, you require a supermajority of 75%. That has been demoted, and now you just need a simple majority. This has not been noted. This went unnoticed, but you already opened the door. Then came Zambia. In the case of Zambia, they raised it. There was resistance from the authorities, but in the end, Zambia is governed by English law. They raised it as a concern in case there is a similar trend in the UK, but there was no immediate urgency to address that. And then the one which is ongoing is Sri Lanka, that to the best of my knowledge, this is an issue. I'm not involved there, but I've been informed that this is an issue of concern for the parties involved. And the question is that even if we don't do anything, with a supermajority, it can be changed. In the case of Suriname, it has been demoted. The question is whether there's no need to go and explicitly say we can change the governing law, because it can be done. And looking forward, what can be done, etc., I don't think that you are going to solve crisis or creditor coordination by changing the law. I think that what we need to do, and this has been evident in the experience that we have witnessed, CACs came in, and basically there was, in Argentina, there was this debate between, as Greg mentioned, basically, shall we follow Anne Kruger and a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism similar to a international bankruptcy procedure for governments, or use a contractual approach, which is CACs, which is what has been adopted in the end. And in Argentina, they went for CACs. Then came the perfect storm, Greece. The perfect storm, because it not only was huge, but it can encompass a number of countries, not just one, more than one. And the same debate came up, SDRM or CACs. And again, they embraced CACs. And now we seem that we are going down the same path for a third time. I think that there are, I'm going to your point, Frederic, basically, and I'm very conscious about drying up the market or making it quite expensive, which Greg pointed out. I think basically what we need to do, we need to try to look forward as to, rather than how we can undermine or produce undesired consequences, how can we complement what we see out there? And one of the issues is there has been a precedent in a recent New York case linked to what's going on in Sri Lanka, that there was a creditor asking for recovery, and the court has decreed a a stay in the procedures. I think it was for 6 months. But again, this has already shown or opened the door to a possibility of another typical feature of bankruptcy, and basically this is something which is a moratorium. It's basically breathing space for the government to come up with a solution by time, which is also something that we are seeing through the use of the climate resilient clauses. If you are hit by a hurricane, you have been your main source of income has been undermined, and you can or you need to divert your main resources to attend more urgent matters. You can stop servicing interest payments for up to 3 periods of time, or 6 months. So basically, pretty much up to 2 years, 3 times 16, but the fourth will be the one that will become due. So basically, you can take interest payment holidays. So basically, you have there already a contractual feature that gives you this, which is basically if you are hit by a hurricane. So basically, it's about seeing whether we should go the contractual route or through something similar to what happened in this legal precedent that I was referring to in New York of this creditor against Sri Lanka, where the court decreed a stay. So I think that there are greater chances of these bottom-up approaches to be bought by both creditors and debtors than imposing something that can end up being more costly, can undermine the lending markets, and can produce some severe consequences that can easily be avoided by changing the governing law.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. That's fascinating and really happening as we speak. Theo, any comments on that?
Yeah, just to second Rodrigo's comment about the significance of what happened in Suriname. The main holdup in Suriname is that even though the threshold in terms of voting has been lowered, you still need the consent of the government to change the governing law. And we will see in the next cases, including Sri Lanka, whether the need for the consent of the government is even removed. I totally agree with Greg's point about the importance of the GSDR as some kind of a safe space where everybody can rant about what they don't like about the current system, and the importance of confidence building. Maybe just a caveat of what this kind of international forums can achieve when it comes to China's integration. We need to think about what are the big reasons for China's reluctance to participate in these restructurings. First one is the domestic political economy. There's no plumbing system inside China to allocate the financial, the political, the economic losses within the system. And it's not something that the GSDR can do anything about. China will need to modify its laws governing the debt write-downs in the policy banks. You need to have an institutional plumbing to give way for these policy banks to negotiate. You will need maybe a budgetary compensation, all these things, and the GSDR can do nothing about this. China's reluctance to participate is also driven by geopolitical considerations. The Chinese want more of a say at the board of the IMF, at the board of the World Bank. It's something that has been pushed back for a while, and the GSDR will not be able to change any of these issues. And finally, the Chinese come to the table in these discussions with very technical questions that have a lot of value, make a lot of sense when you think about, cut-off dates, comparability of treatment, all these issues. The Chinese are shaking up the game that people have been playing for decades, and on this specifically, the GSDR can help progress. Back to the New York bills, the way I look at it is, what's the problem that we are trying to solve? If the problem is that the debt restructurings and the haircuts are not deep enough, it's an issue of IMF program design and DSA. Nothing that the New York bills can do. If the issue is that restructurings take too long and that too much past due interest is accumulated, then it's about fixing the common framework and preventing the sequential aspect of the restructuring where bondholders are waiting for 3 years before they can start negotiating. So it's about asking the G20 to fix the common framework, nothing to do with New York bills. If it's about how private creditors get better terms than official creditors, it's an issue of comparability of treatment. It's defined by the Paris Club, now by the G20 and the official creditor committees. Nothing to do with New York New York law, and it's enforced by the G20 already. So what really is the problem that we are trying to solve? The one holdout situation that we see in the current restructurings is Hamilton Reserve Bank via Sri Lanka. And it's not even totally clear to me how the bills would apply to this specific case. If we think about Champerty, they didn't buy with the intent to sue. They bought with the intent of being repaid in the next couple of months, which didn't happen with the default. So it's not even clear how the laws would apply to the one problem we would ideally try to solve. And then for these technical issues, what matters is the plumbing. It's all very concrete. If we think about the recovery cap, one bill proposes to cap the recovery of private creditors at the level of what the official creditors would have had. All fun and games, right? Everybody agrees with that. But how do you define not more? How do you define as much? The supporters of the bill has said we will just use the comparability assessment that's already used by the official sector, and if they tell us what is comparable, we will say that's the maximum you can get. The problem is that the comparability assessment is not a formula. It's 3 formulas plus a political judgment on top. These 3 formulas are present value reduction, duration extension, flow relief. If you think about a creditor trying to get a judgment and to recover on this judgment, how do you calculate the duration extension of a judgment claim? How do you calculate the flow relief of a judgment claim? How do you calculate the present value reduction of a judgment claim? The current comparability assessment is not suited to define ex ante the size of a judgment claim. So there's some plumbing issues that need to be resolved. And final point, sorry, I'm a bit long. The battlegrounds are actually moving away from what we are trying to talk about. I see 3 battlegrounds today when it comes to negotiations with bondholders. The first one is pressure for the IMF to modify its macro framework in order to free up cash for creditors. The case of Zambia, between program approval and the first review, the IMF removed 2 billion of net portfolio flows into the country, which reduced the forecast for debt service on external debt and freed up cash for the bondholders, for the Chinese banks. So you have this pressure that the IMF is modifying the framework in a non-transparent manner. Second battleground is the use of state contingent instruments. I'm sure Greg will have views on the Argentina case, but what's the point of capping the recovery if you, through the back door, you manage to double your money with the use of state contingent instruments that are not captured? And the last battleground is the use of non-financial provisions, loss reinstatement, most favored creditor clauses that we are seeing appear in the Zambia case, that will also be skewing the recovery in a sense and the comparability assessment. So it really seems to concur with what Rodrigo and Greg have said, that we are trying to fight the battle of the last decade, while actually the battle is already happening somewhere else.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Theo.
May I comment?
Absolutely. I was coming to turn towards you anyway, so
Yes.
you may as well take the floor.
On these comments, first of all, going back to China and what you're saying, Theo and I are actually working on a paper which should be out in a few months, and that seems to be the problem of the world. And if you followed China's problems with its commercial banks in the late 90s, it eventually, to fix them very well, it changed the ownership structure, but it moved all the bad, it did good bank, bad bank, it moved all the bad assets into asset management companies. Each of the 4 big banks moved assets to a different asset management company who then managed the bad assets, and they moved them off at par, so they were recapitalized through doing that effectively by the government. And then they actually had partners, and most of them listed on international stock exchanges. So the big 4 banks, like ICBC, China Construction Bank, Bank of China, they're very transparent organizations, well accounted for. The policy banks, China Exim, CDB, they are not like that. They're fully owned, and they're not issuing financials like that. They issue bonds to the market, which are bought by those 4 banks, but you don't get a full accounting. And we all know, according to aid data, 80% of the clients they lend to internationally are in trouble. Now, CDB mostly lends domestically, which it has lent to a lot of municipalities who are in debt trouble, muni debt problems. Whereas Exim is Exim, so it's international. So they've lent to a lot of people with trouble, and then you're going to a bank and asking them to take write-downs when all of their clients want write-downs at the same time, and they don't have a capital injection because there's a kind of philosophy, well, we don't want to use public money to bail out an organization. And in the West, we're like, well, it's a state-owned bank, why don't you do it? So right now, China's kind of stuck, and it needs to put capital in these organizations. And you have these loan managers saying, when you're a Chinese Communist Party member, they keep track of everything you do in your whole career. They don't want to be the one to sign on the write-down. So any deal which gets contentious, whether it's for Zambia, goes up to the president or the state council, and it takes months and months and months. And so the effective solution in the end will be to take all the problem loans off the balance sheet of CDB and China X and move them to an asset management company specializing in sovereign debt restructuring. So the Paris Club and the Common Framework can deal with a permanent secretariat that deals with these things reasonably. This is going to take time. Right now, the counterparts are different groups of people at different Chinese banks and credit insurers, some of whom work together sometimes, some of them, they're new people, their negotiating positions don't all make sense. So I would congratulate the international community for getting China in, for working with China. I congratulate the Chinese for moving and adapting. For the countries in the middle of it, this is painfully slow, but it took a long time to resolve the LDC crisis of the 1980s. It took a decade. On the scale of that, things are moving month by month. So I remain very hopeful and want to, instead of bashing people for slow, rather congratulate people on their progress. Now on New York law.
Can I add a 30-second comment on China
Yes,
before
yes.
moving to New York law? On China, I would like to add a very brief comment, because basically, and I don't want to make a case for China, but I think that basically, in fairness, we should not demonize China either.
Yeah.
In the sense that I've seen a case where China has been extremely generous towards the restructuring of the debt situation of a crisis with things that defy logic to an extent, extremely generous, while other Paris Club member countries with minimal exposure, I'm saying almost imperceptible, basically they were not willing to assist in any possible manner. So for sake of completeness, I think basically there are some other things that definitely need to be fixed, like for example, a Chinese loan governed by Chinese law, or some clauses of non-disclosure, or the non-comparability of treatment provisions. Yeah, there are some things that definitely need to be worked on, but I think basically we need to be slightly more balanced and not jump up front to conclusions.
Yeah, what I'd say is the third New York law has followed a consultative process, and it is extremely narrowly targeted to only, and it's future looking. It's not solving yesterday's problem, because it only has to do with people bringing excess litigation in New York as a general problem. And there are entities called litigation finance firms who want to make money funding litigation. They're not there to invest in countries, taking bets to get a yield to help a country grow, to invest in a company that's going to build a pipeline or a bridge or a road. They're just betting on lawsuits. And the law discourages that only in the area of sovereigns. They say sovereigns are different. We're dealing with people. We don't have bankruptcy. It's hyper complicated already. We want to discourage that game very narrowly. And so the text of the law basically say this new application of the law, it's actually, the law was already there. Then the funds lobbied to have it narrowed to not apply. So they're saying, well, let's put it back the way it was before 2004, but only for funds who are making a business of litigating. And it doesn't apply to other people. So it's actually very thoughtfully drafted for rule of law people. You can have a distinguished argument on whether it is a pinprick in the purity of the world. But in my own judgment, I don't think it's going to hurt the world. I don't think most investors are going to say, I don't care, it doesn't affect me. It will very much annoy the litigation finance folks. So take a look at it. It's very interesting. Look at the text. It just came out, and there'll be newspaper articles. There's some in the FT and Bloomberg yesterday. Is it gonna pass? Is it gonna be amended? We're going between now and I think January 6th or 8th at the end of the New York season. Now, the other bill, there is one called Section 230, which was the bad of the good, bad, ugly, which people are now saying, well, let's make that separate from the ugly one, and let's do that in the UK too, and let's try to do something that caps claims in court. And I'd be saying, well, if you can make it complement CACs, maybe something could be done. But this, in what Theo said, how do you define comparability? It's so messy, it would take like a half a year of discussion. You'd have to consult with the G20, you'd have to say, does this work with the common framework? You'd have to talk to China, you'd have to talk to creditors, you'd have to talk to Treasury, you'd have to talk to UK Treasury. And so for people who talk about that, I'm just like, you haven't even had the discussion of how this fits into the world. Stop talking about that. There is one bill that's narrowly targeted, that's good. If you want to do something for the world, focus on that one. And if there's another discussion, start that in the fall. In most of that other bill, the 230 people are talking about, almost all but 3 bonds are under English law. And so if you're going to study Section 230, you need to study that as if it were done in the UK. The US is basically economically irrelevant.
Thank you, Greg. I think it's great. My take is that if the New York bill passes, its impact will be very, very limited, possibly beneficial, preventing litigious behavior, which is helping no one, but will not fundamentally change the landscape, which, as we've just discussing now for a little while, is complex and requires a lot of software improvement. I want to keep some time for questions. So just to close, and maybe to be a little bit provocative, because I know that the panelists are quite relish on the provocation. And thinking of Argentina, and we are now in a new political situation in Argentina with an economic situation that remains very difficult. If you had the crystal ball in front of you, Greg, what's awaiting Argentina for the next couple of years?
Well, I'll tell you the saddest thing about the book is I begin the book with great sympathy for Argentina's plight. Argentina in 2001 is suffering a Great Depression, as bad or worse than the United States in the 1930s. Kids are not eating, they're passing out in school for lack of food. Middle-class families are selling their goods on street corners. The banks are closed. It's 4 presidents in the span of 2 weeks. Total loss of confidence, devaluation, default, total lack of trust in the political system. They'd had this IMF-supported plan for a decade and it's gone. One party said they do this, the other party said they do that. They were in the streets chanting, banging on pots and pans, saying they all must go. But then out of the wreckage, President Dualde, who was confirmed by the Congress with the support of the governors, ran a kind of caretaker government until there was an election, and he got Minister Lavagna, and they said, well, we got no friends, and the IMF wouldn't lend him any money, except very strict conditions. And they said, well, we got to run a tight budget. We have this devaluation. Let's work with that. Let's fix some problems. And the economy started bouncing back. And they actually ran very high surpluses, like 5% of GDP for 3 years. And the economy was stabilizing, soybean prices got better, and the country's seeing a bounce. And it had done a tough debt restructuring, but the criticism, I argue, was totally overblown in the sense every creditor I talked to knew the crisis was so bad they should get 50 cents on the dollar. But Argentina gave them, in the end, 34 cents on the dollar in new bonds plus GDP warrants that later paid 18 points. So they actually got 50 cents on the dollar. So if Argentina just paid 50 cents on the dollar in their deal, they would have gotten their deal done without this litigation and crap. But there was negotiating problems in how it was handled in Washington by Argentina and the creditors. But as soon as that deal is done and Argentina is doing well, the discipline of the government stops. Nestor Kirchner fires Minister Lavagna, who is keeping a tight budget, and as soon as he's gone every year, the surplus, the primary surplus goes down and down and down and down to deficit, 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 deficit. So when you look from 07 to 15, while they're finally having all these court battles, and I put a few graphs, they're going into deficits as big as the 1980s. And they're printing money, printing the printing presses, so there's this huge monetary overhang. All the inflation now is because the overspending. So they're in court saying, we're victims of the vulture funds, horrible people, colony, no, homeland, yes. All the same time they're printing the printing presses. So they're in trouble now because, not because the vulture funds were mean to them, they didn't pay him a penny. And they eventually got a good deal in court because Judge Grisey was flexible at the end. They went right back to overspending. And I've talked to people on the team who did the restructuring in 05 and who fought for it and believed in it. They said, we never want to be in default again. We want to graduate. We don't want another 80s. And they all leave. And the printing presses and the overspending starts again. And they say, we were naive. And so then you have chaos after chaos from this. By the time they fix the debt of 2001, they're back in crisis from overspending again. And as this story ends, the world of sovereign debt is fixed because we have CACs. And all the other restructurings are going well. And Argentina is back where it started because it made the same mistake. And it's sad. And when I wrote the conclusion, like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I didn't know what to say. Because I comment CACs change the world of sovereign debt, and Elliot, they made a lot of money. What do I say about Argentina? Are they serial defaulter? What is your hope? And I said, I have no idea. Blank slate. Are you going to keep defaulting every 3 years? That's what Minister Guzman did in 2020. We have COVID, we're going to default. And now the debt's a problem. Is the new government going to default again? Are you going to just default and default and default and decide we are never going to borrow from the world again? We're going to we're going to just be a domestic economy? Or you're going to get someone who comes and say, we're now going to start honoring our contracts. And out of this chaos and frustration with the inflation and frustration with the COVID, this guy with the chainsaw, you can't imagine this. You see the pictures on TV as an American, you're like, who is this guy? And my translator, she's in Spain, she sends me a little gif of him. This guy's insane. And then I'm like, gosh, he's gonna hurt someone, waving it around like crazy. And then I realized that this is the symbol. He said the truth for once. It's not foreigners who caused our problem, it was us. And we spent too much, so we printed too much money, so we got inflation, and I'm gonna stop it. And so he wants to run 5% surpluses to bring down the inflation. That's exactly what Nestor Kirchner did in 2003, 4, 5. That was a big part of stabilizing the economy. And so, but the poor are poorer for having gone through this whole thing. So this is like history repeating, but Milei is not like dancing. He has a theory. He says, I don't want us to ever default again. So if you ever had a historical moment, is this 200 years of misery, this 50 years of nonstop crisis ever going to be over? He's intending to do it. Can he do it? Is it worth the cost? I can't answer because I'm not Argentine. It's a horribly painful adjustment process, but it sure is a change from the history.
Thank you, Greg. Turning to the Argentinian. Crystal ball, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Frederick. My crystal ball gives me just one word, but before I go there, Greg jagged my memory a little bit. And basically, I remember at some point, basically, and this is going back to chaos after chaos, printing money, basically, at some point, Argentina decided as a matter of policy to get rid of the IMF. So they replaced debt, let's say at 3% with the IMF. They issued to, at that time, Cousin Chavez in Venezuela, placed money with him and replaced debt of the IMF, paid the IMF in full, was charging 3% and replaced it with a more expensive debt, which again, it's mind-blowing. But going back to the question, the crystal ball, I see only a single word there, which is governability. Of course, I think probably pretty much every person in a sane state of mind will agree that basically we need to turn a page, we need to respect the rule of law, we need to abide by our commitments, we need to prevent, because basically I think that the important issue here is prevention rather than curing. But the issue is whether it is possible with a government that pretty much came out of nowhere and it's governing a country that has been living from a populist government into another populist government for many years now. And I think that the issue of governability, and he's facing, the current president is facing some difficulties already with some of his policy. There was a big law that did not manage to get through Congress. It was meant to go through Congress now, but apparently that will again be delayed once more. So basically that, I think, is the big challenge.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Theo?
So obviously I have less views than the old-timers or the Argentinians for that matter. Thinking about whether we will see again the same dance between the IMF, Argentina and bondholders, I would point to the emerging role of third parties. In the summer of 23, when Argentina it was getting tight to get the new disbursement of the IMF that would help them repay the old disbursement of the IMF, China repaid the IMF using three means. One was a swap at the central bank with the People's Bank of China. And this swap represents now a large share of Argentina's reserves. They used a bridge from Qatar that provided, I don't remember, maybe a 500 million or something bridge for Argentina to repay the fund. And a regional multilateral institution, I think it was CABE or CAF, I don't remember exactly. So I'm wondering whether in a similar manner, in a way to Egypt or to Pakistan, you might have some of the pressure in the next phase that is relieved by these outside players coming in, with obviously geopolitical implications, be it Qatar, be it China, in that regard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for a great panel. We are a bit running out of time, but I think we have time for a round of questions in the audience, and I have a couple online. Yunan? Thank you.
Hi, I'll kick things off. Yunan Chen, Research Fellow at ODI. I wanted to ask a question about something that came up very briefly on state contingent debt instruments. Obviously, Argentina used a GDP-linked warrant, which ended up paying out, and this was something that was criticized, I think, cost Argentina a lot in the end, and Greg, as you pointed out, maybe ended up being quite neutral in its effect. SCIs or GDP-linked or macro-linked instruments are now being proposed again in several other debt restructurings and pushed quite hard. So I wanted to hear the panel's views on these. Are they really worth it in the end? What are some of the caveats that you would advise for governments considering these kinds of tools?
Thank you. We'll take a round. Let's take a round of questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mark Boland. I'm a sovereign debt analyst here in London. So my question, I'm looking forward to reading the book, maybe the answer there. So, what drove Argentina to drive this hard bargain? Is this a kind of vestige of US involvement in Latin American politics? And now you have a lot of country governments that are signing off on deals with substantial payment flows in the near term, who many think won't actually solve any of the debt distress. So what's the driver there, or have they learned from Argentina's mistakes?
Sorry, one quick question. Sebastian Seria from Fundara, think tank in Argentina. The question is, it's not that Argentina, disclosure, I'm from Argentina. It's not that Argentina did all of this in the dark. That means it's been a serial defaulter over the years. And it's not that it hit its personality, but nevertheless, we continue to fall into this problem. And I understand blaming Argentina on one side, but what is the role of the lenders, and what is the role of the rating agencies and the various financial institutions that promote these kinds of mistakes? And then obviously at the end, the bondholders are the ones that pay, and those financial institutions in many cases are just intermediaries of the overall asset owners. So what can be done so that we don't fall into this again from the other side?
Thank you. Max, please.
Max Mendez Parra, Principal Research Fellow here at ODI, and also disclaimer also from Argentina. I mentioned many times, you mentioned IMF, was mentioned. I want to actually, from the book, actually, what has been the role during the renegotiation of the IMF? Clearly, I understand the role of the IMF in actually triggering the crisis in 2001, but I wonder during the restoration, particularly because actually the government in 2005 actually paid it off actually to get it out of the way completely. So that would be specifically what is the role of the IMF. And the other question is, talking about the role of the Argentine government, that can be aggressive. I wonder at one point basically whether the attitude of the government also play a role in the outcome of the negotiation, particularly because the negotiation became a sort of part of the domestic politics, and at some times basically the government was infuriating, for example, Justice Griesha many times. So I wonder whether that attitude, not only the aggressiveness, but actually the attitude whether played a role in the outcome of the negotiation.
Thank you. Yes. And then I'll throw two more questions that have come online. One question is the outlook on the Ukraine restructuring. I think, Theo, you mentioned Ukraine, if someone has something to comment. And then a question on just mentioning Sri Lanka and the fact that the negotiations are evolving and the fact that it's all delayed. Could they be a system that would be more predictable for the countries in distress, that would also encourage them to seek relief or start negotiation early? So the question of predictability. Now,
Yeah, let me try
Right,
to
please,
get
yes.
the first questions, and I'll dodge Ukraine and Sri Lanka. And combining with the GDP and your additional questions we could have an hour and 15 on state contingent instruments. And I kind of owe a 50-page paper on the Argentine GDP warrants and the multiple litigations, how it was used. I thought it was used quite intelligently. If you need a deep haircut, which is very painful to the savers, why not give them a lot of upside if your country does better than expected? It was fair, but there were so many other problems with the deal. The benefits of that structure were lost in the noise. So I'm favorable on it, but there were also drafting errors and other mistakes, calibration errors. In terms of your question about what was Argentina thinking, I spent a year and a half talking to the principals of this negotiation on all sides. The investors, the IMF, the Argentine team. I talked to Guillermo Nilsson at least 7 times, to Lavagna at least 4 times, and before I put pen to paper. And I feel I give a completely clear and honest expression of Argentina's view, whereas the market is, Argentina was horrible and they made all the mistakes and they were unreasonable. And that's not true. They were on a mission, they saw the world a certain way. And this is just a classic debtor-creditor battle where they have different interests and different worldviews, and they fight over the terms of a deal. And I introduce them that way, and have been complimented by both Guillermo and Roberto on the quality of my discussion, saying you got this right. And so it's a sympathetic view of that debt exchange offer. They really didn't want to default ever again. They wanted to solve the crisis and misery. You lose sympathy for Argentina during the story when the overspending comes again. You can't hurt creditors again and again and again. If you make a promise, we're going to do a haircut, but we're going to fix everything, that's why you have a haircut in an IMF program. Because you get a haircut, but then you have a program and a discipline to fix the country. But Argentina twice now did a haircut with no IMF program, so no discipline follows. That happened in 2020. That happened in 2005. So there's the question is, should creditors ever give haircuts without the context of an IMF program. I think in terms of your question of the responsibility of lenders, I have always advised countries, and I think countries have to take responsibility for what they do. When a country goes bankrupt, the debtor will always try to blame it on the lender. But usually the lenders don't know what they're doing. They just want to get some yield. They're not thinking, they're dispersed. And that's just a talking point in a negotiation. A country has to be prudent itself to avoid hurting itself later. Blaming the lender is something that's part of the game. So I don't think the problem of the world is lenders. The problem of the world is that poor countries don't have access to capital. Problem of the world, China stopped lending to the poorest countries. We got to get them lending again, according to the US Treasury. And I think your question too, the book just goes through all of the dynamics of how the IMF dealt with this and how the US Treasury dealt with it. And it was a very complex interaction, and that's the 100 pages. I'm really selling a court battle, but I was so fascinated and so important, the software errors of the 2005 trade. If people were just more reasonable, there never would have been all the litigation. You didn't need SDRM and you did not need CACs to get that deal done cleanly. The litigation proved, well, we better have CACs or SDRM or something because litigation can get messy, but this deal itself, the differences could have bridged if people were just smarter. And it's very rich, and I abbreviated it, but I put enough there you can get the whole story. And the creditors, the debtors, even Jamie Minette, Elliot has said you did a really good job. This is what happened. You got it all, and it's correct. So I'm happy that it's being accepted as a truthful history of events, and it's not a partisan piece.
Thank you, Greg. Theo, any response to some of the questions?
Yeah, so starting with SCDIs, state contingent instruments, why do they appear in restructurings? Because you have a gap in expectation about the economic outlook between the creditors and the country and the IMF. And sometimes the country will even disagree with the IMF, but the country even cannot just change the IMF debt sustainability analysis. I would distinguish between two types of cases. First one being when you have massive threshold effects. This is Suriname, where you have an oil discovery that will have a transformational impact on the economy. This is Zambia, where the IMF's debt carrying capacity is just creating massive threshold effects. And in these cases, state contingent instrument will be the only way to get out of the mess and hammer down a deal. Then you have other cases where the disagreement is just that some creditors don't like IMF projections, but in a linear manner. They think the IMF is just too pessimistic on effects, on growth or whatever. This is Ghana, this is Sri Lanka. And the risk in having state contingent instruments for these cases is that you will maintain countries on the brink of that distress, even if they recover. Basically, as soon as they have a bit more growth, as they outperform a bit, the state contingency will make sure that the debt repayments go up and you're always on the brink and you have no space to borrow more or to just recover and to get out of that distress. We often think about the impact on the market of these instruments. Hedge funds like them, real money accounts don't like them so much. They are not necessarily index eligible. They don't trade super well. But I would insist, on the other hand, on the impact for debtors. These instruments are extremely complicated in terms of debt management. You have legal risks associated with them, as the case of Argentina illustrates well. These instruments make budget management, cash management more difficult when you don't know how much you will have to pay, how much you will have to pay in the next year. And they can make the return to the market more complex as well. Because good luck pricing new instrument when your curve on the secondary market is just swinging whenever you have economic data coming out of your country. Then the questions were about Ukraine and Sri Lanka. A brief outlook on those two.
Yeah. If you don't feel we have. I know we are running out of time, so I just want Rodrigo to say a few words.
Thank you.
Responding to some of the questions.
I think I will start with Yunan's question about contingent instruments. I think, and basically the question was around what are the merits of these instruments. I think that they are extremely valuable, particularly to get a restructuring to the finish line. And there are some particular cases where they are extremely valuable for that. I think, for example, looking forward. And I think basically now in the last question, we're trying to project with Sri Lanka, Ukraine, etc. I think basically for the case of Venezuela, they can be extremely useful. The problem, and here kicks in the lawyer, is the devil is in the details. The structuring, the wording, that's where it becomes, the mechanics, that's when it becomes very difficult. There are problems in pricing them accurately. That goes why basically Theo was saying, basically there are some people that prefer them over others. The structuring of them is very difficult, and the ensuing litigation in Argentina is linked to a little bit, has to do with the detail of the black letter and the mechanics, and issues that whether Argentina should have paid or not, whether there had been some manipulation as to the data reported to by Argentina that would have triggered or not a payment. Sebastian, if I got your name correctly, the issue was about responsibility of lenders, CRAs, and whether the role of and then whether the role of the government or an aggressive stance have an impact on things. I will try to group all this in kind of one single answer for sake of time, because I am the only thing now standing between lunch. So the issue here is lenders lend to make money. We need to accept it, we need to like it or dislike it, but if you borrow, it's because there's a lender who's willing to make money. So the issue is, it's lender's fault, or is it the government who has a fiduciary duty towards its nation, towards those that vote in elections, to those that then riot on the streets, those that have to suffer hyperinflation, confiscation of their deposits. So, some of you might have heard me before on a paper that I wrote in the past about that. I think basically the onus should not be on the restructuring or on pointing fingers, but has to be put on prevention. The issue here is do not incur unnecessary debts, do not incur opportunistic debts, do not incur, and going back to what we were discussing about pain of the IMF, so the IMF doesn't have interference on Argentine economy and basically borrow at a higher interest rate from Venezuela. Basically, that's, I'm getting hyped and I'm trying to control myself, but that's a silly mistake. That is a silly mistake. I was going to be slightly more explicit. And the question as to whether the aggressive stance of a debtor in a negotiation plays a role, it is kind of self-evident. I think basically, if you go into a negotiation saying, I'm not going to pay you, at best I can give you 5 cents on the dollar, of course you will feel offended. Of course, basically you will become less willing to engage, to negotiate. So it is, I think basically I disagree with that take. On the outlook, on Sri Lanka making it, on the two online questions, on Sri Lanka making it more predictable, I think that we are transitioning that path. What we have done is we have created, the international community has created a common framework, but the common framework, and I think basically Greg mentioned this, is basically we are bringing China and the US together at the table. And this is something that basically we are not going to solve it with the stroke of a pen. This will take time, it will take back and forth. This will be things that we will get right, things that we will get wrong. And we have seen this recently with Zambia and the comparability of treatment position. But I think that we are transitioning that path towards greater predictability. Are we there yet? No, but we're moving forward. And I think it was Theo who mentioned that probably if I'm putting it too explicit, but it was, we have the Argentinas of the world, and then we have other restructurings that kind of post-Argentina have become kind of, and Greg also said database, they are smoother, faster, probably not as fast as we want to, yes, but basically there's a distinction there. And on Ukraine, I prefer not to do futurology, and I think that basically there are too many pieces at play there that can give different outcomes, different scenarios. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I apologize, we overrun 10 minutes, but I hope you will agree it was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Greg, for coming, stopping and presenting your book. And thank you very much to Theo and Rodrigo for their really engaging and stimulating views. And thank you for coming. And thank you to our online audience. And please come and let's have some lunch.
One for ODI.